everybody. Welcome to this evening's event with our very distinguished speakers tonight on disinformation and challenges to democracy. Just a quick word on technology before I hand over to Asha Allen, who I will be introducing quickly as well. So we have a Q&A function at the bottom, as most of you might know. And if you have any questions, you can submit your questions via the Q&A function. You can also upvote questions and like them if they are very similar to one you've already, you yourself might have. So yeah, please use the Q&A function to submit questions during the discussion. And so I'm quickly introducing Asha Allen, our moderator for this evening. So Asha, she serves as the Advocacy Director for Europe, Online Expression and Civic Space at the Center for Democracy and Technology Europe office in Brussels. She leads the CTD's work on issues at the intersection of online expression, civic engagement, and technology. And her work focuses on advocating for the preservation of fundamental rights in European Union and regional legislation and democratic accountability in industry content policies. I'm handing over to Asha now. She will be introducing the speakers, and I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And hello to everyone. Good evening to our participants joining online, and welcome to this event on disinformation and challenges to democracy, organised by the British-German Association. It's my honour to be with you this evening. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. As mentioned, my name is Asha Allen, and I'm a human rights and digital rights advocate working here in the European sphere on tech policy and platform accountability. And I'll be your moderator for this evening's discussion. So, with 2024 being dubbed by many as the year of elections, the impact of disinformation on our democracies is very high on the political agenda. Regulation and new laws in both the UK with the Online Safety Bill, in Germany and at the EU level, all contain provisions aimed to address the lawful content that can still be harmful to individuals, communities and societies more broadly, of which disinformation falls into this category. We have esteemed speakers tonight to shed a little bit more light and their insights on these vital issues. And to kick us off, it's my honour to pass the floor to Jessica Cecil, a news journalist and documentary maker and founder of the BBC Trusted News Initiative. Thank you so much for joining the discussion. Please, Jessica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Asha, and thank you very much. Good evening, everyone who's joining, and it's great that you're here. My contention is that disinformation is already a challenge to democracy, and the danger is it's going to get very, very much worse. First of all, stepping back, what is disinformation? Disinformation is information that its creators know to be false, but create and publish in order to pursue some wider goal. So the very intention of disinformation is to mislead for a purpose. And why does it matter as far as democracy is concerned? Well, democracy relies on decisions by individual voters made on the basis of information they can trust. And if that information is manipulated or distorted, then the process of democracy is undermined, and ultimately it's a threat to its legitimacy. So just to kind of row back, why is it a problem now? Firstly, it's because of the way people get their news. And if you're interested in this, I would urge you to look at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. I'm a visiting fellow there, so full disclosure. They do a digital news report every year, and that is the most authoritative source, in my mind, to global news consumption patterns. And what that has shown is that increasingly audiences turn to social platforms for their news rather than going direct to established news organisations' own websites or apps. And we're now at a point where globally people now turn to social sites such as TikTok or Facebook for news more than they turn to those news websites. So it's really important to put that context. What that means is that social platforms are places where anyone can publish without the editorial filter of an editor on it. And even when platforms don't particularly want to be news platforms, they end up being news platforms. I think it's really interesting that Twitter X remains an important news platform, whatever Elon Musk may or may not want. And even new participants like Threads, ultimately owned by Meta / Facebook, started out as a place that didn't have any aspirations to be a news platform at all, but has increasingly come to be a place where people share news information. And the same is true of TikTok. So the final thing is that emotionally resonant content that reinforces existing beliefs spreads fastest and is likely to go viral. Next, individuals and states have learned how to manipulate this new environment, whether it's for money, for geopolitical influence, or for other motivations. And often we don't know the motivations. We have for a long time seen Russia roll out its playbook. Obviously, most came to most of our attention in 2016 when the so-called Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg sent out messages in an attempt to frame the 2016 election in the US. Since then, we have seen a huge tsunami of disinformation associated with the Ukraine war. It has put out everything from claiming that civilians in bombed hospitals are crisis actors and a whole lot more besides. It's infiltrated individual Facebook groups. And most recently in the Slovak elections a couple of months ago, there was a huge amount of disinformation that we think came from Russia. So it is very much a current and present threat. We have manipulation also from other players globally, from participants in China. We don't know whether the government or not, Iran, and from other places, as well as disinformation from players who want to make money by manipulating public opinion and indeed affecting markets. Finally, AI is making this potentially much, much more potent. It's changing the game because clearly, if you can create something that's highly plausible using Midjourney or 11 Labs or any other number of programs that are freely available, you can create incredibly convincing deepfakes from audio, video, stills. They're super convincing, and we are concerned that they are going to change the nature of knowing and detecting what's true and isn't true. And I think just in the last month, we've seen with the Israel-Gaza conflict, the effect of really, really dangerous disinformation. And this is not AI manipulated for the most part, but it is mislabeled footage, horrendous amount of video that is purporting to be one thing, but is actually something entirely different and done for effect. Whether it's battle footage pretending pretending to be a battle footage and is actually from video games, or casualty and bombing that actually comes from historical archive footage from Syria and elsewhere, and so-called imposter content. And this is where there is disinformation that pretends to be from a trusted news source, but is nothing of the sort. But using that branding is often very, very difficult to work out what is true and what isn't. And as Asha said, the fear is that in all of that, you have a situation where there are elections to come across the European Union, in the UK, in the US, in India, in Mexico coming up. So what is to be done? Clearly, regulation is one thing. I won't talk about that because I know that Lutz can talk much more knowledgeably about that. But I think what is interesting is the suite of actions that the US laid out at the beginning of last week, which suggests that there is real thinking there, and obviously there's thinking in the EU that Lutz will talk about, as well as in the UK. And I think the second thing is the whole concept of pre-bunking news. It's something that obviously news organisations can take part in. What it is trying to frame a narrative before you think the disinformer is going to try and frame it for you. I would say that I've been really surprised and interested in the Ukraine war in the way in which the UK government has declassified military intelligence and posted it on Twitter in order to frame what they believe is going on and try and get the story out before they think that the Russians are going to get a different story out. It's interesting because it's novel, but it's pre-bunking in action. You have individual platform actions, but what I would argue is really important also are the cooperation between news organisations and news organisations with platforms. I started something when I was at the BBC called the Trusted News Initiative in 2019 that came out of the Indian elections. The Indian elections, we found there were lots of fake polls purporting to be from the BBC using BBC branding that were on Facebook and Meta. And we didn't know what to do about them. At that time, the way that we could complain to Meta was to join the queue behind lots of other people, and it took days for anything to happen. So false polls that could have affected the way people voted within an election were going unchecked. So we created a model whereby we had a fast alert between members of the Trusted News Initiative who could tell each other if they came across disinformation that was both viral and represented an immediate threat to democracy or an immediate threat to life. Low volume, high impact. Now, I'm very proud of what we did, but I wouldn't overclaim for it. I think the way in which we have to look at disinformation is many bricks in a particular wall, and this, I hope, is one of them, because I think it's an increasingly important and urgent story, but I think you need many ways of tackling this really, really harmful phenomenon. And I think part of that is also that, as well as news organisations and tech platforms playing the part, I think the final word I would say is I think that democratic politicians also need to know that they have a role in not dabbling with disinformation as well. So I think my time is up at that point. I'm very happy to take questions, and thank you, Asha.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Really, one, for sharing more about your important work. As for me, it's engagement like this that actually forms an essential part of a co-regulatory framework when it comes to addressing disinformation. But really, for several key points I wanted to draw out from what you said there, the importance of understanding that access to relevant information when it comes to participation in elections is actually a right enshrined in the international human rights framework, and that really must be maintained. Otherwise, how can we talk about equitable participation in elections and democracy if that was the case? But also for raising the discussion, which is emerging very much in the regulatory context here in Brussels, on the impact of AI systems such as general purpose AI on the dissemination of information. And I know this emerged very much so in the discussions around the Digital Services Act, and in which was a key area for me, which actually specifically identifies threats to civic discourse and electoral processes as a key systemic risk that platforms actually now have to mitigate as part of their mandatory due diligence obligations. But lastly, for really shedding light on specific situations in when tackling disinformation is most important, and that can be in times of crisis, in times of conflict, and it's so essential that we adopt the right and proportionate mechanisms when it comes to addressing this. So thank you so much for those insights. And I hope this makes a nice segue into some of the issues that you might wanted to cover there, Lutz. Now, just to quickly introduce, Lutz Güllner is the Head of Strategic Communications at the European External Action Service here in Brussels, and very much looking forward to hearing your intervention. And just to our participants, please feel free to start leaving your questions in the chat.
Thank you very much, Asha, and great to be on a panel here also with Jessica. A couple of days ago, actually, we spent a whole day together discussing these issues, so even more so. And given that I'm German, maybe in this British-German kind of association, I have the German head, even if I'm speaking here from a European perspective. Look, I don't want to repeat what Jessica said. That's why just picking out a couple of things and going a little bit deeper. And I think the first thing always to be said is if we speak about this disinformation area, there is always a big confusion about the terms, about the phenomenon. What is it exactly? Is it now everything that is false? Is it lies? Is it something that has been whatever, that is manipulated in itself and something? And of course, we could spend a whole evening in just putting little boxes of what is misinformation, what is disinformation. I think what really the absolute important element is, and there I repeat something that Jessica said, it's the intention behind the creator or the disseminator to mislead or to pursue a specific aim. And that specific aim can be a political one, it can be an economic one, it can be very different things. But the idea is somebody goes into this information space and either starts to lie or to produce content that is denigrating, misleading, sowing confusion, sowing mistrust, undermining. It's all this in there. And that is important to keep in mind, because sometimes we get a little bit confused in these debates about what exactly is the issue that we want to address. Do we want to, in inverted commas, clean the internet of everything that is not correct? And of course, that's not the aim, because that would be, first of all, a Herculean kind of task, and secondly, is in a let's say in a public discourse in a democracy, well, certain things are wrong, and it's and there is nothing that forbids also to be wrong or to have only one opinion. That is called usually censorship. So we need to balance all this. And I think a very useful kind of term, and Jessica knows exactly what is coming from our perspective, is to work with the term information manipulation. Somebody who's actively manipulating the information environment or specific content or uses specific techniques to achieve this aim. And I'm saying this because I come to a very specific point. I think most of the participants maybe will ask here, yeah, but the moment you work on this, the moment you address disinformation or information manipulation, you will automatically reduce the freedom of speech. So how do you reconcile that? And that would be true, and I'm using the conditional, that would be true if we have good content and bad content. If we have, so to say, a black and white box of something that can be said and something that is not allowed to be said. And that is, of course, not the aim, because we are in a free society. There is freedom of speech, and we cherish and defend it, teeth and claws. But how do we address then the issue? And the approach that we have taken also in our work here in at the European level, in particular when we look to external actors, how they interfere, how they want to use our information space with disinformation, misleading, or pushing their own interests, is by way of using very specific techniques. So it's the behavior behind it that really counts. How things are manipulated, which techniques are being used, how certain content is, not only what the content is, but also how it's produced, what types of elements are being used to mislead people. And therefore, this manipulation is actually at 3 levels. It's a manipulation of content, of course, that's what we see quickly. but it's also a manipulation of identities. Very often, the way disinformation and information manipulation is working is to use large networks, inauthentic networks, actually, that quickly reproduce, that quickly allow to disseminate and to amplify these voices. And therefore, it's not just a question of is the content right or wrong, but it's also what do people do to do this. The second point that I wanted to make is how harmful is it? And that is, of course, difficult because we will not be able to measure it scientifically. So also here, picking up on a few thoughts from Jessica, I think the issue is always to say harm can go on both sides. Harm can be produced by interfering, by misleading people. To the worst, it can be by pushing them. For example, think about in pandemic times, that we have seen very harmful content also about health, about vaccines, about what you can use, in against COVID, or what is an effective way of preventing, of addressing it. That's the one side. But the other side, harm can also be produced if, and here comes a key word, if people are squeezed out of the debate. So if a real public discourse is actually undermined just by way of taking an enormous space with the content. Some here might remember the quotes by Steve Bannon. Sorry to use something slightly vulgar, and he said, you need to flood the space with shit. And that is a form of interfering, of capturing the space. And what is the if junk, let's call it like this, out there, but also that genuine voices of genuine people will not be heard anymore. And I think we need to pay a lot of attention also to this phenomenon of suppression of voices, that people cannot express themselves anymore because A, they don't have space, or they are intimidated, they're trolled, they are kind of being pushed out of this public discourse. Third element, what can we do about it? Also here, I would focus on three areas. The first one is what we call in our jargon situational awareness. We need to have a proper insight in what is happening. We need to develop the tools. We need to have a methodology. Otherwise, we argue, with what I would call kind of anecdotal evidence, maybe the random thing here, the random thing here. So we need to have good tools and analytical tools also to understand what is going on there. Not to control the internet, but to have an idea, is somebody manipulating? How does that work? How can we measure this? And of course, always to show what are these techniques? How does it work? And that it's not too abstract, I give you a very tangible example. We had a couple of weeks ago a very famous case, let's call it like this, of a new technique that has been used in particular by the Russian, what we call the disinformation ecosystem. And that is the cloning of websites. So websites of The Guardian, of The Spiegel, of Le Monde, and many other newspapers and outlets with a very good reputation have actually been cloned in a way that you could not see as a layperson. You could not see the difference anymore. With small changes in the URL. So you go to this thing, you think this is The Guardian or this is The Spiegel that I cherish, and this is my newspaper or my outlet. And then the content, however, has been altered, And what was the result? That people take these contents and believe that this is from the outlets that they trust and start to share them. And of course, act them as kind of disseminators of this type of disinformation or manipulated content as well. And it just shows that kind of these very, very sophisticated, or sometimes very sophisticated, sometimes a little bit less, techniques can have a huge impact, and you need to inform people about this. This is the situational awareness, So these techniques, the risks, who's doing what do we see, is absolutely important. Second pillar, I would call resilience. Resilience in the society. It's something that nobody disagrees with, but it's very difficult to do because it has a lot of different components. The work of Jessica and her colleagues is a key component. So in journalistic activities, in these initiatives, also in trust building, in transparency, for example, but it has also many other elements in education, in also what you are doing, Asha, and many others. You know, this we need to piece all these elements together to build resilience in the society. There is no silver bullet. There is not the one thing that will help us. We need to piece all this together. And the third pillar of the responses is, of course, regulation. There is a small caveat only that regulation is absolutely necessary, but regulation, as we discuss it at the moment, is focusing very much on the social media platforms. Social media platforms play a huge role, absolutely, but they are not the exclusive place where disinformation and information manipulation is happening. So in my view, we need to look at this a little bit more holistic also in the future. We also need to look at websites that are out there that look like information portals, but they are not information portals. We need to look at linkages, you know, with offline actors, think tanks that have been created that are no real think tanks, and kind of to look a little bit broader as well. But coming back to the social media platforms, we have now in the European Union a law, the Digital Services Act, which is very close to what has been discussed in the UK. A little bit further going in its development. I think, Asha, you mentioned it. It is a new approach that does not prescribe what can be said and what cannot be said, but which turns it around and says, there is a risk. The bigger you are and the more systemic your role is, and of course, very large online platforms with millions and millions of users in the EU, they play a significant role in our societies. And therefore, if they are subject to manipulation, this poses a risk, you know, for our societies. Hence, they have an obligation for basically two things: A, transparency, and B, accountability. Accountability in the sense of putting in place effective ways of dealing with the risks. And that means, of course, also resources, etc. So this law is now brand new, more or less, in operation. It, of course, still needs to go through its, how can I put it, through the tests, you know, through baptisms in plural of fire. We are seeing the first test now with the Hamas Israel issue, where it's not only about disinformation but also illegal content, such as terrorist content, such as hate speech, and other type of that. But we have an instrument, and that is extremely useful. With a little caveat that I said before. This will not solve all the problems, but it's an important building block. I want to close by basically kind of recalling also that disinformation, information manipulation is not a new phenomenon. It's around for tens, for hundreds, maybe for thousands of years, you know. But what is new is, of course, this digital element, the speed of sharing content, the possibilities also of altering content. And that brings me to the point that Jessica also made about artificial intelligence. We had, when Jessica and I were on the same panel, we had a discussion. How much is artificial intelligence really a watershed moment? Is it really a paradigm shift or not? Jury is still out there, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because we see already that it's much easier to produce. The volumes can go up much quicker, and we see new forms. It's not only text-based, it's of course much more image-based, video-based, audiovisual-based. By the way, even voice messages can be changed because with these voice changes, etc. So we have a bit of a new horizon that is coming there. And to close with a unfortunately not very optimistic note, I was today with nearly 90 participants in a discussion that was organized by the United Nations Development Program in Brussels. It was all electorate commissioners or authorities from countries all over the world. And the colleague from Sierra Leone, he said, climate change is a huge challenge for us as a country in our country. But I quote him, if I look at what is happening in the information environment, I'm equally concerned, about this. So something that is really needs to be taken very, very seriously. We must not over-regulate it, but we need to have a proper understanding at a political level that something needs to be done step by step. And there, of course, also looking here at our German-British kind of perspective or EU, UK perspective, it can only be addressed together between like-minded, to learn from each other, maybe also to learn from the mistakes of each other. Core ingredient is the cooperation, is the key and central role of civil society in this. I stop here, Asha, back to you so that we have enough time for discussions or questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lutz. And I have to say, I'm sorry for missing you. I'm speaking at this UNDP event tomorrow on gender disinformation. So I think we just missed each other, but wonderful to hear your insights from that conversation. And I really want to pull on what you're saying there and the importance of civil society and a multi-stakeholder approach. But you mentioned some really key elements there that I wanted to just re-highlight, and that was the importance on terminology and definitions when it comes to disinformation and understanding the type of content that's being captured in this definition, because for civil society organizations like mine, this is such an essential discussion, because we want to ensure that powerful platforms are not in a position to actually be making inappropriate determinations on our political expression, but we also don't want to create ministries of truths either. And so it's so important to strike that right balance, as you said, but for also opening this discussion on the importance of process of how to address the issue rather than the focus on the content itself, because this is where you start to get into the murky waters of the protection of free expression. And of course, the need for further evidence and impact by way of research, so we can really develop evidence-based forms of risk mitigation that are much more impactful from that perspective. So thank you so much for your insights. So I see we already have two questions. I would like to address them both to you, and I think I'll do them one by one, if that's okay. So the first question we have is, which media sources do you recommend? Now, this is quite an important question, because I think it actually opens up a whole new line of discussion if we were to go quite in depth in that discussion. Because, of course, the appointment of trusted media has very much been central to this. But a question that is raised for many is, who decides and designates a media organization as trusted? If you especially think about that in the context in which, you may have media pluralism that might be being challenged, or democracy is backsliding in a specific context, that's really been at the forefront of the mind for human rights advocates in trying to strike that balance. So to pose that question to you both, maybe Jessica, I'll come to you first based on your experience. Which media sources do you recommend? You're still on mute, Jessica, sorry.
Apologies. I recommend a really wide, nutritious diet, because I think that my personal ones, what do I read? I obviously read the BBC, you would expect me to. I read the New York Times, I read The Guardian. I also try to look at the Financial Times, the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph, and the Atlantic. So those are that's a sort of wide basis. I think it's really important to look at sources that are international, and also sources that come from a slightly different place from the one that you might naturally gravitate to. But all of those media sources share something very important, which is that they have an editorial code that thinks about the importance of accuracy. And they also are bounded by complaints. So when they get things wrong, they're prepared to look at that and say that in a transparent way. So I guess those are the media sources, but also think about the framework around the media sources that you look at, would be my recommendation.
Wonderful. Thank you. I want to take that quote with me. Wide, nutritious diet, I would say is great. I too read several different news organizations from different regions with an emphasis on Africa and Asia for developing stories, just so it's really good to get a broad overview of what's happening. Lutz?
Yeah, you put me in a tricky situation as a government official. Of course, I shouldn't recommend anything and could only follow what Jessica has said. But let me say, key ingredient of every news organization is the editorial code. If that is missing, I would be very, very kind of hesitating, let's call it like this. And this is, by the way, because we're also talking a little bit broader, this was one of the reasons why we have sanctioned, for example, Russia Today at the time, of the start of the war. We had this discussion with Jessica, not because we did not like the one or the other content or the opinion of a specific journalist, but because this is not a news organization with an editorial code, with editorial kind of independence, with the necessary kind of procedures also, but it's a tool of a state. It's nothing else than that. And in that case, it has been used to support the war of aggression as well. Hence, this is really the core element. And I think also the colleagues at Meta, at Facebook, have worked very intensely on how to deal with state media. Not every state media, and I'm saying this in particular as a German, where we have this the public radio, and you have the same debate about the BBC. It is on the one hand, not everything that is related to the state is a problem, but then again, many people mistrust as well these constructions. But what is important is transparency in all this. So who's financing what? Who's taking which decision? Who's in the editorial who takes editorial decisions, etc. Absolutely, absolutely crucial in all this. And then on the other sources, I would always go with a dose of skepticism, not to mistrust every news source, because we know this is a rallying cry of the anti-democrats as well, to say, in German, the famous Lügenpresse, so the liars from the media, has become a huge issue, that you cannot trust it. It's all establishment, etc. And hence this look only at social media. But nevertheless, a healthy dose of skepticism is always very, very good. So who's running this news organization? Is this information portal that I found by coincidence, or that addressed me, or that I got from somebody that maybe I don't even know? Who's running this? Who's owning this? Where do they get their news from? Very, very important. And I find it's a little bit, my colleagues always kind of stop me when I'm saying this, but I still like this. I find it's a bit like in a supermarket, so like a consumer. You come in, there are certain consumers who only want very expensive top-end things. Fine. There are some consumers who are absolutely kind of without any specific opinion, and they want to let them be convinced. They look around, but they want to be protected against anything that is misleading. And if they buy the yogurt, whatever, where nothing else is in, and it's written there, they want to be sure that also nothing else is in there. And those who want to buy kind of whatever junk products, they will do it anyway. And I think we need such a mentality in our information sphere as well. I mean, I don't want to compare the information environment to a supermarket, but more from a consumer's perspective. We need to protect those who kind of are open to other sources, who are curious about other things, who are not bound just to one newspaper or not just the New York Times and the Guardian, maybe who don't want to pay for that, etc. but we need to find ways of helping them that they don't fall into the trap, if there is a trap, of course. And so it's a question of empowerment in the end.
Thank you for that, and I think that point on empowerment is super important. But you both touched on the point of this, of going to news sources that have accountability mechanisms in place and codes of conduct by which they adhere to. I think that is a really good way to kind of look at where you might be looking to, but also those other points that you made. Now, the next question we have is on bad news traveling fast. How can we promote uplifting news? Now, this, again, I think actually opens up a whole new line of discussion, because when we're looking at it from the online context, this touches upon issues that I'm deeply familiar with when it comes to things like content recommender systems and how algorithms actually make determinations on the content that folks are seeing, and opening up the black box of algorithms and how they actually work and why we're seeing the content that we're seeing. So do you have any reflections in particular in terms of uplifting specific aspects of news? Jessica?
If I understand you, yeah, bad news travels fast. I think what we know is that emotionally resonant news travels fast. Rather than saying it's bad or good news, I think the issue that you've got is that if you've got emotionally resonant news, so if you take somebody like former Brazilian President Bolsonaro, he used to put out social media feeds the whole time. It was sort of very, very emotional. And you had fact checkers that were attempting to look at the veracity of that news, but were doing that rationally and logically and slowly. And so you had almost two currencies. You had fast moving, emotionally resonant news and sort of slow, rational fact checking news. And I guess that's the way I think about it, which is how rational, the rational dissection of claims can be done in the time scale that you need to counter this very emotional news that tends to move very, very fast, and it's viral and it's upranked quickly. And this is where I think the issue of pre-bunking comes in, which is if you think that very emotional claims are going to be made, you can try and lay out your stall very rationally beforehand, because it's really, really difficult to get the kind of traction that you need if you're trying to be rational against this emotional news. So it's not quite bad news, good news, but it's more emotional versus rational is the way I would think about it.
And that's an excellent point. It ties into kind of the engagement that we have with content in the social media context. We're responding to it in that emotional way, whether it's like or love or dislike. And I think that's quite an important aspect to it. Lutz, did you have any perspective on this question?
It's hard to say. There is another study that talked about disinformation is traveling much faster, but because of exactly the element that Jessica mentioned, because of the emotional kind of presentation also of things. I mean, good. I mean, we get very much to personal views, etc. here. In any case, it's not the role of any government to kind of whatever direct kind of more positive news. I think governments are trying to do this anyway with their own policies, etc. But I think what is quite important is we need to leave some of the decisions, of course, to information consumers. So in the sense of if there is a real interest in the end also in stories that are not kind of this sensationalist, I think there is a movement and also outlets that start to really go more into these I don't want to call it uplifting, but more constructive stories, etc. Something happening in journalism, Jessica, you might know much more about this, which is getting more and more traction. Yeah. And I think this needs to come from the midst of society. This is nothing that you can decree or kind of inject, etc. from outside. I would feel very, very uncomfortable with that in any case from a government perspective.
Asha, if I may, I'll just add to that. You're absolutely right. Look, there is a growing movement around constructive journalism. What is solutions-based journalism? Rather than telling people just what the problems are, also try and tell them what some of the solutions might be. But clearly, I would say this, that is entirely a decision for newsrooms, but I think it's also something that audiences do often respond to, because as well as a problem, they want to know what some of the solutions framing it might be.
And that's very interesting in thinking about how one of the solutions to this may be rethinking about kind of more traditional ways of communicating information that we've been, how we would absorb it previously. So that's really interesting. So I did want to come to the next question, and it is on free speech. So the question is, do limits of free speech need to be reset in the age of disinformation? As a human rights and free expression advocate, I'm not answering this question myself, but I'll come to you first, Lutz.
Okay. Freedom of speech is for all the liberal democratic societies one of the highest goods that we have and that we will protect. There are very, very high hurdles in all our constitutional systems, in particular, if I look at the UK, at the EU, and many other places, luckily in the world, where this is kind of absolutely enshrined. And there is a danger that the so-called fight against fake news, and please set all this in inverted commas, is actually very often used as a pretext to curb free speech, So how do we get out of this dilemma? I think two important elements. The first one is that we need to be careful not to focus too much only on content. As I said before, content is, of course, a very important indicator, but what is important also is who's behind it, how was this produced, which techniques have been used, which intention can I deduct from this. These are all indicators that we need to develop much more. And if somebody is using a troll farm, if somebody is using inauthentic accounts, if somebody is using other forms of, let's say, of amplification, which are not kind of authentic, and which point to the direction that somebody is not so much kind of telling his or her opinion, I think it's a good indicator. And it gives us also a much more objective way of saying this is legitimate and this is less legitimate. It's not a perfect approach, of course, but it's a direction of getting out of this dilemma of having good content and bad content. Of course, there is also good content and bad content. If we move into illegal content, for example, etc., which is, of course, anyway covered by law enforcement. The second thing, and there I would really like to keep it a bit with Maria Ressa, who the Peace Nobel Prize winner, who said, this focus also, it's a bit the same argument, sorry, but the focus on disinformation. The disinformation is like the projectile, like the bullet, that we see that causes the harm, the wound, etc. But somebody fired that bullet. And somebody has a weapon in his or her hand, who fired that bullet. And it's just a metaphor, of course. But so it's important to look at the entire system, at where does it come from, and how did it travel. And that is maybe the points also where we need to make much more effort. You mentioned yourself and kind of this type of recommender system, and plenty of other elements that we can do. There's a new kind of discussion at the moment. It's a very technical term. Sorry. It's a kill chain approach. So if you know that certain whatever content has been produced with the intention to mislead, for example, you can actually find a way that the amplification chain can be cut, things like that. That can be done. But to summarize, so a pure kind of focus on content will not be helpful, because we will always be in this dilemma of free speech. So let's also look at actors, at behavior, at techniques being used. I think very, very important elements. And related to that is the freedom of speech is there if every person has an equal voice. Let's call it like this. I mean, it's a bit generalizing and idealizing, of course, but nevertheless, as much as possible, give every citizen a voice. If disinformation leads to the point that certain citizens don't have a voice anymore because they have been squeezed out of the debate, for example, or they have been intimidated, and this might be by internal, domestic, or by external actors, then we have actually a problem. And then the fight against disinformation is precisely there to protect the freedom of speech, to ensure that genuine voices can be heard. I know this is in an ideal world, is very difficult to do, but I think this is the mindset that we should approach, or in which we should approach it.
Thank you. I really couldn't agree with you more. And I think to reiterate the point on focusing on the content, not just on the content, is quite important. And I would take the opportunity to reiterate the point that solutions to potentially tackling disinformation, because of the potential impact it's having on our societies, can't actually lead to what we term as fear-inspired policy making, because that leads to actual detrimental policies, which disproportionately impact usually the historically marginalized and oppressed. It's in moments of crisis and moments of uncertainties that we need to protect those values the most, in fact, because they really are our foundation. Jessica, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question.
I think I agree with both of you. Free speech is absolutely fundamental to open societies, and open societies, free journalism plays a very important part in open societies. So anything that undermines free speech is really bad. Just to reinforce what Lutz said, in several countries around the world, there are attempts to, under the cloak of fighting disinformation, to actually bring in laws that inhibit free speech, and that's really, really bad. I agree with you, there is a vast spectrum between speech that I would argue is immediately dangerous and is not an infringement of free speech. I don't think anyone would argue that Russian disinformation purporting to say that Ukrainian civilians who've been hurt are crisis actors infringes anybody's free speech. And the fact that there are very, very difficult and contested places doesn't mean you can't do anything about the far extremes. So I would argue there are places in which you can make very clear content decisions that don't infringe free speech, but never, ever should we lose sight of the fact that the values of free speech are absolutely fundamental to open societies. And if in fighting disinformation that is compromised, then that's very dangerous.
Can I just add a small point, Asha, which kind of also is a good complementary element there. Our open societies live with this liberal way of everybody can say what they want to say. They can even lie if they want to lie. But if this openness, if this free speech becomes our vulnerability, then of course we need to do something about it. And we need to balance this in the right way. But if the openness becomes our weakness, then kind of is the moment to reflect a little bit. In Germany, we had a very nice impression during the Cold War. It was called the wehrhafte Demokratie, the democracy that can defend itself, And I think we need to kind of think a little bit along those lines. So how can we defend the democracy without undermining it, exactly along the lines that we just discussed?
Thank you. And I think we can potentially agree that takes a multi-pronged approach do that, right? And certain mechanisms work very well when it comes to legislation in other areas, increased due diligence in other areas, and how do we bring those pieces together and build the capacity of others who provide an essential part of that cog as well. So we have 5 minutes left, but I do want to make sure we have the chance to answer all the questions, and we have one more. And that question is, how does the phenomenon of echo chambers play into polarization, and how can this be tackled? Jessica, if I could come to you first on that question.
Well, it's obviously an issue that people often gravitate to content that reinforces what they already believe, so-called echo chambers. But I think I would like to actually go back to one of the pillars that Lutz talked about, which is societal resilience. Societal resilience comes from a place in which people live in a society that they trust people who have opposite views. So there's a technical answer, which is that you have echo chambers, and these are problematic because they are places in which you increasingly reinforce your own views, but those themselves are a reflection of divided societies. So I would argue that you need to look at the technical issue, but you also need to look at the wider societal issue.
And I very much agree. It's about looking at both aspects. I would even say there's more than two, but those aspects of where those issues are very specifically coming from. Lutz, your thoughts on this question?
I don't know if I have anything to add to that. Echo chambers in themselves, let's say, is not a new phenomenon. You know, we have seen this very much in corporatist structures. You know, if I look at whatever, even the Dutch society in the 50s and 60s, you know, where basically all the Protestants and all the Catholics and all the trade unionists, you know, had their own newspapers, their own TV channels, etc., is not kind of per se kind of the indicator that everything is going wrong. The problem is only this amplification, this permanent kind of reinforcement of specific views, etc. And there we come again to the digital age, because this is not only passive, it's also active. And I think this is something that sometimes is a little bit underestimated. The real, how can I put it, quantum leap that we have seen in disinformation in a digital age is actually that people can actively participate. Propaganda in the Cold War, for example, was a leaflet or something. You see it, you consume it, you know, but very seldom people then started to photocopy it at home and started to distribute it. If now in a digital age, it doesn't take anything, and actually you are an actor per se, because you immediately share it. You like it. Sometimes you reproduce it in other forms, and everything is possible at the individual level. And it makes kind of individuals also actors. And I think this is and if you're then acting in an echo chamber, then it has a double amplification, and in certain cases even radicalization, as we have seen from a lot of also if we look at it at other areas. I don't want to compare too much, but in political radicalism or religious radicalism, you know, we see these things happening. Anyway, sorry, just random thoughts kind of on top of on Jessica's.
No, but relevant thoughts, I think, there. I think it also kind of touches upon this question of the commencement of what may be termed as echo chambers. You know, the online space provides many people with actual communities, in fact, where they can share and they can exchange and they can build each other's capacities and really support one another. So it does really kind of open up a very complex question. So I did see in the chat there was a resource shared about some of the work from the EU on their programs when it comes to disinformation. There's many others, and I'm sure we can share quite a few. But I wanted to thank you both for the really, really amazing conversation. I was highly engaged, and it's been wonderful to speak with you both. And I will pass back over to Tamara.
Thank you so much, all of you, Asha, Lutz, and Jessica, for joining us tonight and give you a very insightful talk about this very important topic of disinformation and challenges to democracy. I'm very grateful that you took the time to do this. And just a quick note on upcoming BGA events. So on the 29th of November, we have a talk with Jürgen Kraus and Luisa Weiss on German baking, something completely different. And then we have an event, our annual carols and readings in the Christuskirche in Knightsbridge in London. So I hope you can join us there. And thank you very much again to all of our speakers. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I'll see you soon. Thank you.